Okay, listen, this episode I'm going to open with a content warning. If your ears are delicate, or if you don't have small children around, or you don't have a child's sense of humor, or a child's sense of curiosity, honestly, you might want to skip this one. But I think we've got an interesting topic to talk about, so here goes. Don't say you weren't warned. Today we're going to actually talk about, I'm going to start with really, a fact about a truly naughty word. It's a four-letter word. It starts with F, and we don't use it in polite company. It's also a very ancient word. You guessed it, the word I'm talking about is fart. Yes, the loud expulsion of air from your nether orifices. Also known in Hindi as pad, coincidentally in Latin as purd. And the reason why there's a Latin and there's a Hindi, and in fact rather a Sanskrit origin, and German, ancient French, Old Germanic, Old Icelandic, frata, fisa. This is a really ancient word. This word is probably around 2000 or more years old. Probably goes back to the first spread of Indo-European languages across the Eurasian continent. And that's pretty amazing, because though today we giggle or we just stare at kids who use that word and pretend we're too grown up to actually give that sort of thing any importance. Every time we do use that word, we're accessing an ancient part of our heritage. And I think that's really important, don't you? This word, like many others, has remained remarkably unchanged over the couple of thousand years or more that it has been in use. So usually when you're using it in one of the Indo-European languages, the Indo-European languages stretch from traditionally Europe all the way to India, parts of Central Asia, and it includes everything from Spanish, English, French, all the way to Assamese, Bengali, and everything in between. I'm probably missing a couple to the east of that as well, Sinhala as well. So, and across the board, you'd find words like this, words like fart, or purd, or pezd in Russian. And they are remarkably similar even today. Now I'm going to use slightly more nicer words, maybe mother, father, brother. If you actually looked at the etymology of these words, you realize how similar they are, whether it's across Sanskrit, whether it's Latin, whether it's English today, Old Germanic, and the various other Romance languages, and the Slavic languages as well. Some words, like this one, are ancient, and yet they're in common use. And in this case, we have the Indo-European language family to thank for that. We're talking over here about a language family that, I'm not going to get into where it originated, all right? Because, again, like most things in this world, this is an intensely political conversation. There are people who insist that it has originated right here in the Indian subcontinent. The broader scientific consensus outside of India is somewhere in southeastern Ukraine. But wherever it did originate, the amazing thing is Indo-European spread from there eastwards into India, or perhaps westwards from out of India. So India, the Indian subcontinent, marking the easternmost sort of limit of its expansion, and out west right up to the absolute end of the Eurasian landmass, which is the European peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, and every single land in between. The speakers of this family of languages displaced previous inhabitants, or rather displaced previous cultures, while not changing the inhabitants' genetics too much. So what you will find across the board is that the genetics of the populations perhaps haven't changed as much as the languages have. And certainly the Indo-European turnover was a huge cultural change, but perhaps not as much of a genetic change. I'm not going to get too much into that, because there's a lot of sort of buried landmines there in terms of politics and in terms of history, but it's worth reading all sides of the story and just kind of understanding, where these roots have sort of come from. But they're just so common in all the words that we have. Let's just take the example of the word for tooth. Okay, so we say tooth and teeth, but Latin was dens, and dens, dentist, or denti, which was multiple teeth, or dentem. But of course, in Sanskrit, da, dants, dantas, dante, dantam, right? And then obviously in Hindi you have dant, you have, and in Greek you have odon, odontos, odontai, odonta. And so you have this D, T, and then N connect, which kind of stays consistent across the board. Now you look at a lot of words today, you realize that if you break them up, and if so spoken languages, of course, the accents and the vowel shifts, etc., make it difficult to sort of listen to a language and understand its etymology or understand word etymologies. But if you actually do read the words, what you can do is actually pick out the connection. That's the really interesting part. So you do this it's very easy to do this with Indo-European languages, and you do a little bit of reading and you realize how connected Indo-European languages are and what level of similarity exists in numbers, in certain common objects, in common relationships, so on and so forth. Okay, so you have the Indo-European language family. If I had to kind of put a number, again, like I said, it's very political, and there's a lot of controversy around the whole idea of where it's from. But if we had to say roughly put, again, scientific consensus number on when it started out, it would be perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, roughly. All right, it's very hard to tell, and I certainly can't claim to know exactly when. But 5,000 to 6,000 years is probably a decent timeline, plus minus about 1,000 years or 1,500 years, to kind of say that roughly around then is when there was a language that people are calling, or scientists call, linguists call, Proto-Indo-European. All right, the sort of great granddaddy from which all these other Celtic, German, Italic, Greek, Slavic, and of course Indian, Vedic, Iranian, for example, languages came from, right? And they all kind of grew out of that one sort of granddaddy. There are a lot of lost Indo-European languages as well. There were the Tocharians who lived in the Tarim Basin around, so what is now Western China and Central Asia, a couple of thousand years ago or more. So there's lots of interesting little bits over there, and there's truly fascinating sort of bits that you'll find. You'll find, for example, certain civilizations in Anatolia, which is now Turkey. So the Hittites, for example, and the Mitanni perhaps, and some of them were using gods like Mitra and Varuna in their contracts, in their legal contracts, for example. So you'd have you have a lot of truly ancient roots that you can still access now. So all right, so you have now we've pushed the horizon back on a lot of interesting words to about 5,000 years ago, all right, or let's say 6,000 if you're being really sort of pushing it out there. But I read this really interesting piece a few years ago, and this was an amazing paper that came out. I think this was in 2013. And if you listen to this sentence, all right, you hear me give this fire to that old man, pull the black worm off the bark and give it to the mother, and no spitting in ashes. It's a very odd little speech, but there was this paper that a team of researchers worked on from the University of Reading, and they pieced together, using a lot of maths actually, a sort of proto-language, not even a proto-language really, a sense of some really ancestral words that probably went back about 15,000 years. And so they're saying, and this is the thing, so this is within the Eurasian continent, all right, so from Europe to more or less East Asia. And this is again not actually touching on all the language families. Yes, the obviously the Indo-European language family, but also perhaps Turkish, Uzbek, Mongolian, which is part of the Altaic group, the Dravidian families of South India, Uralic, which is Finnish, Hungarian, and a few other languages around Central Asia and the Caucasus and Siberia. So this sort of spread of languages had some common Eurasian ancestor that left behind some words for 15,000 years, all right? So they're what they call ultra conserved words. The real lifetime of a word is actually pretty short, and it's getting even shorter when you think about how fast culture is evolving today, and perhaps over the last couple of centuries, you realize how short the lifetime of a word is. I'll give you an example. If you look at the word thou used to actually mean, so the word you was aap, all right? So what we in Hindi use for with a little bit of respect. So if you want to say aap to someone, you said you, and if you wanted to say tum, that would be thou. And so over a period of time, thou got sort of more and more archaic, and today thou is the sort of, in fact, it's the other way around. Thou is actually thought of as some sort of very grandiose usage. And it's not really used anymore, and it's hardly been a few hundred years since it was last used seriously, and so it's completely out. We're sort of familiar with the word, but we don't really use it at all anymore. And so if you think about it, 500 years, 1,000 years at most is probably a good life cycle for a word. 15,000 years was before humans were writing. 15,000 years was most probably before humans, certainly before they had any cities that we found. There's a site called Göbekli in Turkey, which is now thought of as the first perhaps urban agglomeration. There are probably more since last I've read, but even that is, I don't know, 7,000-8,000 years old. Probably not. Maybe 9,000, not older than that. 15,000 years is a very, very long time ago. Right about then, there were some words. So mother, not, to hear, man. And some of these you can imagine. Mother you can imagine. And there's a really interesting theory around the word mother and also father. And I'll come to that. So some of these are fairly, you can sort of imagine that, hey, these words are probably, I can understand them being really old because they're such basic and fundamental pieces of information that they represent, all right? But funnily enough, even ashes and worm, these words were thought to be really ancient. So 15,000 years is when we've kind of pushed this whole sort of timeline back. Now, if you take a cross-section of most languages around the world, all right, the vast majority, the word for mother has a nasal sound similar to either m or n, mostly m, so mama or amma, and variations thereof, all right? It's almost universal. And of course there's a lot of stories about how, a lot of people said, well, this must be the oldest word that exists, and all right, so let's say we can imagine why that happens in, say, Indo-European languages, because they all come from one root, Proto-Indo-European, all right? But you even have the same sort of combination in, say, Swahili, which has connections to Arabic, so mama and baba, and Tagalog from the Philippines, which is nane and tate, and Fijian has nana, tata, Mandarin has mama and baba, Chechen nana and da, Eskimo has anana and atata. So you're getting it, right? You're getting the MN sort of sound for the mother, and the TD sound for the father, and that's it's just one of those things that is so universal that a lot of people said, okay, if a linguist sort of looked at it and said, look, if we're going to look at this, we have to look at perhaps why these words are so basic. They haven't changed at all. I mean, it can't be that the word that these words were spoken by the first humans, I don't know, 150, 200,000 years ago, and then just nobody's changed it ever since then, right? And I'll give you an example, all right? So in Proto-Indo-European, there's a word, there's a root that they've derived, all right? So the root is Breg, all right? And this is really interesting. The connections, the cognates, which is all the words that have the same root, which is Breg, today are brachial or brachial, which has to do with the arms, Then you have pretzel, which is pretzel, and bra, and merry. So brachial, pretzel, bra, and merry. Alright? So why? Breg means, and they derive this, alright? So Breg, something like Breg, probably meant short. Alright? So when the Greeks derived from that, or when Greek was derived, it related to the upper arm, which is the brachial, which is the brachius, alright, which is short. And in Latin, it derived into crossed arms, which then derived into the pastry, which is the pretzel. And then finally, into French, which referred to shoulder straps, right? All around the upper arm area, around the arm area, which has all that same derivation of short. And so shoulder straps became bra from brasier, which is shoulder strap, right? And then finally, the direct descendant is merry. And merry is because another really ancient saying, short and sweet. Something that is short is usually sweet, and so short and sweet. So the word short literally translated, or rather descended, evolved into the word merry. And so that's a really ancient thought process that exists as well. So anyway, so that sort of, detour aside, Mama and Dada have just stayed the same, and right, and if it's across all these languages, all that evolution that happened to the word short has not happened over here. And so there was this linguist called Roman Jacobson, all right, and he figured it out, and I don't know if you want to say there's a fair amount of consensus on this fact. And so if you listen to babies making sounds, okay, the easiest sound is ah, 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 because it's literally an expulsion of air, and you're not doing anything with your tongue or your lips. It's literally air going over your vocal cords, right? So ah, ah, ah. If you do ah and close your lips for a bit, let's say when you're going to nurse, right? As a baby, you need to nurse. So let's say you're going ah, ma, mum, right? So that's what babies do. And babies, when they're speaking like this is just a sort of play, but it's just mum. Excuse me. The baby's going mum, much higher, of course, much higher pitch than this. And so mama, the person he's or she is talking to, and I'm using air quotes over here because obviously the baby's not talking to anybody, but the individual is sort of is engaging with the baby, and she says, yes, mama, mama. And so in that back and forth of almost accidental communication, that just turned on and turned into this word called mama or mum or nana or nun or variations thereof. And so you have mama over there. And then it's interesting, if you look at papa and dada, and if you actually make the sound, all right, you go pa. So you're going when you put your lips together, and then let's say you hold together and right, those literal sounds. This sounds ridiculous, but it's so cool. I'm just the brilliance of this theory is that it is so simple and so absolutely believable. All right, so you do and then you just add the R sound, so it goes pa pa ba ba da ta ba, right? So you've got papa, baba, tata, dada, which is the dad sound, and that's always the second one usually, right? Because the closest caretaker and the source of food really of nutrition is mama, and then the next possibly caretaker, or the next possible individual that they are familiar with is probably dada, right? And so on and so forth. And now this is the really interesting part. A lot of words in many languages, especially Indo-European languages, have for words related to the self, and related t related to for words related to the second person. So me and you, or thou rather, right? So me and thou, or main or tu or tum, right? In French is moi and toi. And even in Russian you have menya and tebya. So you in Siberia you got met and tet, right? So the self-identification with me, with mama, with me, and to dada, to the tea, right? And so that's really interesting. That's sort of the next step, because one is who are the caretakers, and then two is when the child starts developing an identity of me versus the outside world, how they kind of look at that and how language has kind of picked that up. It really blew my mind reading this, and it was so interesting, something so basal and so absolutely just, you just walk past this kind of fact every day and you don't realize it, and then when you sort of read a little about music and you realize, wow, that's just amazing. So, and there are so many of these little clues, all right, that are buried in the language we speak, all right. So I'll give you another example. There's a tight sound like e, sounds like this. Humans across the board, no matter what language they speak, tend to associate them with smallness and speed, fast little things. Perhaps because rodents make them. So this guy called Brent Berlin he's an anthropologist who did a really interesting experiment with 600 students, all right, and he found some like absolutely obscure Amazonian language, which obviously none of these 600 students had heard, and he gave them two words. One referred to a bird and the other referred to a fish. All right. And I'm telling you, I kind of, without reading the answer, I kind of tried to experimented on myself with this, and I got it. It was absolutely right. So there's two words. All right. One is meuts, and the other one is chunchuikit. I knew it almost instinctively. Chunchuikit was the bird, because it's a little small fluttery sort of thing, all right? And meuts is probably something else. Sounds like, I don't know, it could be a fish or it could be, a dog or whatever, but a chunchuikit sounds like a little bird and not like a fish, right? So it's something, if you think about that you realize that small things sound small in whatever language you go. So there are clearly some really fundamental rules to the way humans process language. And smarter people than me have done a lot of research about this, but it's super interesting. Of course, there are a lot of red herrings. So there were anthropologists who were studying Aboriginal languages in Australia, and somebody was chronicling this now extinct language called Mbabaram, and they said, okay, all right. They asked one of the last surviving sort of tribe Aboriginal people about various words, and he said, okay, what's the word for dog? And the chap said dog, and he said, no, what's the word for dog? And he said dog, and he said, the Mbabaram word for dog is dog. And this is a language that had evolved by itself uncontacted for probably 15, 20, 30, 40,000 years, however many thousand years that they had remained uncontacted in Australia. And so, but that sort of thing is a red herring, because it's clearly just one of those things like Douglas Adams, in The Hitchhiker's Guide, and those of you who've read it know the whole sort of linguist's whiskey and soda conundrum, right? Or the gin and tonics one. So across the universe, there are drinks called gin and tonics, and various slightly different versions of the gin and tonic sort of phrase, and linguists all across the universe go mad trying to figure out what the connection, and there is no connection. Sometimes they are just linguistic red herrings. So that happens, but there are a lot of there's obviously a lot of sort of borrowing and sort of sharing in languages as well. I'll give you an example: the word shampoo. And I found this really interesting thread the other day on Twitter about shampoo. And of course, I knew that the word shampoo comes from the Indian champu and champi, right? Because we've used products for our hair for a long time. And so for us, the idea of washing our hair using something to make it look more beautiful, and we know the importance of hair in Indian culture. Boy, don't I know, I'm bald. But anyway, we knew this, and when the Brits first turned up over here, I'm going to cast back to my episode of last time and just add another thing to the stuff they've stolen. When the Brits came here, they and this is true, the idea of bathing every day was an absolute novelty to them. All right, and we have records to this effect. And they borrowed the idea of washing their hair regularly, and the word for it, was Shampoo or Champy, and they've turned it into shampoo. And that really, and then there's of course Juggernaut, which comes from Jagannath, and there's so many others. And Gully, by the way, is another one. There are so many words, loot, that have Indian origins in English. But that's the thing, that's the story of English, all right? So English is a terribly difficult language for non-native speakers and for people who haven't grown up speaking it, because English breaks every single linguistic rule you can think of. And that's because English started off as a Germanic language. And then Vikings Frenchmen of Viking extraction, who were the Normans, invaded what was the Saxon land, England, and they brought this sort of French overlayer onto that, old French overlayer, and those mixed up, and then English just sort of went around the world picking up whatever it felt like, and so suddenly there's like all sorts of words and tones and spellings in English. But the most amazing and important part of this whole thing is that's why English has had the staying power it has had. And I'm aware colonization and etc. But the ability to pick up words, Schadenfreude being another one, and just use them, take them for what they mean, hoi polloi from the Greek, and just integrate them into the language. And that honestly is the most amazing part of English. But I think it is the key to a living language. Any language that strives for purity, any language that strives for absolute order, any language that strives for absolute structure is headed towards extinction. Absolute purity, order and structure are literally the recipes for entropy. All right, so no species, no family, no nation, and certainly no language should strive towards that sort of absolute purity, because that means at the end of it you're actually going to end up with a dead language for people speaking it, and that's it. All right, and so I for one welcome the idea that we should be able to make and break languages. We should be able to twist them to mean things that perhaps twist words to mean things that they didn't mean, but now they do. I for one enjoy the fact that Indians today are sort of doing things to the Indian language that probably horrifies everyone west of the Suez. But hey man, there's 1.3 billion of us. We should just go ahead and do it and make it mean what we want it to mean. And let other people do that to our languages as well, as far as possible. That ensures life, honestly. And there's a word that I've talked about before that I really think we should integrate and should practice in our practice of Indian languages, which is obviously Jóla bókaflóð, which is an Icelandic word, which literally means Jóla means Christmas, bóka means book, and flóð means flood. And so the Christmas book flood, all right? So where at Christmas everyone gives each other books and then spends the night drinking and reading the books. That's my contribution to the English language, or rather that's my contribution to all the looted words. I've looted this one, and I think this one is one that should be here to stay. This has been a bit of a long one, but it's been a bit of a fun one. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned. I'll be back next time. Ta-ta.